Wow, we have a packed room here. I don't guess y'all know who's coming up next. Anyway, I would like to introduce our next person to the stage who actually does not need an introduction. Kresser. He's a practitioner of integrative and functional medicine, the creator of one of the world's most respected natural health sites, chriskresser.com, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Your Personal Paleo Code. Please welcome to the stage, Chris Kresser.
Thanks, Michelle. Thank you. All right, so as you can see, I'm going to talk about how to win an argument with a Paleo Critic. And I'm going to give you two versions. There's a short version, and there's a long version. So here's the short version. All right, so you're welcome to leave the room if that satisfies it for you. If you're interested in the longer version, you can stick around for a little while longer. Okay. So that was a little unexpected, wasn't it? So paleo's exploded in popularity. You all know this. I mean, the number of people in this room is a testament to that, and the fantastic growth of these conferences and discussion of it in the popular media. But as it's grown in popularity, so have the critiques, right? I'm sure everyone in this room has seen any number of the critiques that we're going to discuss today. And every time a critique gets published, I'll typically wake up, open my email, and see like 192 messages from people that want me to address this latest critique. Does it mean that the diet, we've all been talking about and following is bunk, and should we go back to being macrobiotic vegans or vegetarians or whatever? So I'm a little out of breath because we went to a barbecue place for lunch and there was a lot of traffic on the way back. So I need to kind of settle down here a little bit. So I wanted to take the opportunity to answer a bunch of these critiques in one place so that you're all armed with all of the ammo that you need in these discussions that you have with your friends, family member, doctor, etc. So I'm going to talk about first some general tips for debating, discussing. I would definitely recommend not doing what I started the presentation with if you want to make progress. But I'll share some other tips. Then we're going to talk about 7 specific critiques that I find are the most common. And then if we have time, I'm going to open it up to you to tell me some critiques that you've heard in case I can address those, and hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A. So here's the first tip. Don't be a jerk. I say this, half seriously because there's this old saying, he who speaks softly carries a big stick. And I don't think that's really about volume of speech or the tone of voice necessarily, although those play a role. To me, this means that we get a lot further with respect. You've probably noticed this in your own life. The harder you push, typically the harder someone's going to push back. And it's also true that none of us like to be made to feel like an idiot. And I know that's true for me, and I imagine it's true for you. Raise your hand if you were born into a family that was following a paleo diet and you followed paleo your entire life. All right, that's what I thought. Not a single person. Raise your hand if you used to think saturated fat was bad for you. Raise your hand if you used to think red meat was bad for you. Maybe you didn't eat it or you kind of felt guilty when you were having that big juicy steak. All right. So I think it's pretty clear that all of us were in the position where we thought this paleo diet was bunk at some point. And so for me, it helps to remember that I was once, a paleo critic, per se. Maybe I wasn't actively a paleo critic, but I had the same beliefs as the paleo critics. So tip number 2 is to acknowledge what's true about the critique. And it's usually the case, not always, but usually the case that there is a shred of truth in the paleo critiques. And I think if you acknowledge that, you gain credibility and you also establish some common ground in the discussion. And that's going to take you a lot further than just denying everything about the critique. So the third tip is to admit the things we've been wrong about. Now, some of you know that I like to say this, but the history of science is essentially the history of most scientists being wrong about most things most of the time. If you look back, any period of history, scientists all thought they knew the answers. The world was flat, sun revolved around the earth. More recently, everybody was convinced that ulcers were caused only by stress until some very brave researchers introduced the idea that they're actually caused by a bacterium called H. pylori. And I don't know how much you know about this story, but these researchers were essentially ridiculed for years for thinking this. And it wasn't accepted widely until they swallowed a vial of H. pylori and infected themselves and gave themselves an ulcer and then treated it with an antibiotic before people even began to take them seriously. After that, it was still many years before this new concept was adopted in mainstream medicine. More recently, if you would have went to your doctor 10 years ago, even today in many places, and you said, "Doc, I think I have leaky gut," this is what they're going to do. You got to stop reading the internet. You know, like you're spending way too much on the internet, time on the internet. This is you've probably been to see some naturopath or acupuncturist, you know. But when you look in the scientific literature, intestinal permeability, and I had to give it kind of a more legit name, is one of the hottest topics in scientific research. It's been correlated with conditions as diverse as autoimmune disease to autism spectrum disorders to Parkinson's to rosacea and eczema to inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome. So the message here is that things change, and they should in science. Science depends on us questioning our hypotheses, even our most cherished hypotheses, somewhat ruthlessly. And this progress of science requires that kind of honesty, and I think we need to apply that to even our most cherished paleo concepts as well, if we want this to be a credible movement, if we want to really influence a big number of people instead of just talking to ourselves continuously. So legumes, I think, are maybe one of the best examples of this. Of course, the paleo dogma holds that we should avoid legumes because our ancestors didn't eat them and because they contain compounds called lectins and phytic acid, which can be harmful. But it turns out that there's a growing amount of evidence that suggests that our ancestors did actually consume legumes, and in some cases, quite a bit of them. So that's a little iffy, that argument. And then lectins can be harmful, but the lectins that we typically find in most beans and legumes, with the exception of maybe peanuts and soy, are quite easily broken down by heat, aka cooking. So if you cook legumes, the lectins that otherwise might be a problem, get into the bloodstream and cause harm, aren't really a problem. There's another issue, which is that 53 other plant foods, fruits, vegetables, herbs, and spices, have discernible significant amounts of lectins, sometimes more lectins than are found in legumes. And many of these are paleo-friendly foods like zucchini or melons or strawberries, etc. So if we require a complete avoidance of lectins to be paleo, we're going to be avoiding a lot more than legumes. And then you have the phytic acid argument. So phytic acid is a compound that inhibits mineral absorption. And certainly we want to reduce our exposure to this as much as possible. But there are a lot of other, again, paleo foods that are higher in phytic acid than legumes. For example, spinach, Swiss chard, almonds, that beloved paleo nut, and walnuts are all much higher in phytic acid than legumes are typically, especially lentils. So if we, again, apply the same rigorous standards and critical thinking to our paleo concepts as we do to mainstream critiques and concepts, we might find that we have to change our views occasionally, even on some sort of untouchable subjects. So now I'll discuss 7 of the most common critiques. Number 1 is some version of this. Why should we follow the paleo diet? I mean, those people all died when they were 30 years old, right? So you've heard something like this before. So it is true that the average lifespan of our ancestors was short and shorter than our average lifespan today. But that doesn't take into account important considerations, challenges that they faced that most of us living in the industrialized world don't face today. So they had very high rates of infant mortality, 30 times higher rates, in fact, of infant mortality than we have today, 100 times higher rates of early childhood mortality. They had absolutely no emergency medical care. They were subject to exposure to the elements, so they could very easily die from freezing if it got really cold out and they couldn't find shelter. They had extremely high rates of trauma and injury due to violence and warfare. It may seem sometimes like we live in a violent society, but it's an absolute utopia compared to what a hunter-gatherer society is like in terms of violence. So these are the challenges that reduced average lifespan. It wasn't about their diet and lifestyle. So if you take a hypothetical group of 10 people living in the Paleolithic era, let's say 2 of them died at childbirth, another 3 died during early childhood, maybe another 2 died from tribal warfare and violence in adolescence, and the remaining 3 live long, healthy, vibrant lives and die, peacefully in their sleep, which is all we can really ask for. The average lifespan of that group is going to be very short, right? Because most of the people are dying young and in childhood. But the average lifespan does not tell the full story, and that's why it's not a good metric in terms of gauging the health of a particular population. So today, our life expectancy in the US is 78 years, and this increase in life expectancy has not happened because of changes in diet and lifestyle. It's actually happened in spite of those changes, because of things like antibiotics, sanitation, modern hygiene, emergency medical care, less violence, and increased social stability. So an interesting question might be, how long would contemporary hunter-gatherers who maintain their traditional diet and lifestyle live if they had access to these advances in modern medicine and hygiene? And in fact, researchers have asked this question and answered it. It turns out that contemporary hunter-gatherers with even the most rudimentary access to modern medical care, which means in some cases they have to walk for a half a day, to get to the most basic medical clinic where they can have, an infected wound taken care of or deal with any other kind of trauma or injury from violence. These people live an average of 68 to 78 years, which is not very different than our life expectancy, as I just said. And more importantly, when they reach age 45, which means they've escaped the most risky periods of infancy and early childhood, they can expect to live another 25 to 27 years after that, so into their 70s, again, very much like life expectancy in the US. But here's the really good news. We don't have to choose. We don't have to choose between hunter-gatherer lifestyle and life expectancy and the standard American diet and lifestyle and life expectancy. We can take the best of both. So we can use the traditional diet and lifestyle of hunter-gatherers, which, by the way, enabled them to reach these ages that are similar to our age, the ages that we reach, without any of the chronic inflammatory diseases that plague us today. No diabetes, no obesity, no heart disease, not even any allergies or asthma, no autoimmune disease, which now affects 50 million people, almost 1 in 6 Americans. So they lived to these ages without getting any of those diseases, whereas now in the US, many of us are acquiring these diseases even during childhood. And we may live a couple, 2, 3 years longer in some cases, but what's the quality of our life during those years compared to the quality of their life? So we can take the best, learn from the best of their diet and lifestyle practices, which kept them free of those chronic inflammatory diseases and also remarkably lean and fit. And then we can take the best of what modern medicine has to offer, emergency medical care, trauma care, and even drugs in certain cases when they're appropriate, and combine them to live even longer lifestyle than what the typical standard American life expectancy is. So critique number 2 goes something like this. Well, we don't live in the Paleolithic era anymore. We're not cavemen, so why should we follow a caveman diet? After all, human beings are still evolving. So it is true that human beings are still evolving, and that's something I think that the early paleo movement got wrong. Our genetics are largely the same as they were in the Paleolithic era, but recent evidence suggests that evolution is occurring at a rate 100 times faster than the average over 6 million years of hominin evolution, and that in fact as much as 10% of our genetic code shows evidence of recent selection. So this means that even in the past 10 to 12,000 years since agriculture came onto the scene, 10% of our genes have changed. So that's, it's not all of them or even most of them, but it's a significant change. And these genetic changes do affect our tolerance to some agricultural foods, and dairy is perhaps the best example of this. So throughout most of our history, humans only produce lactase, which is the enzyme required to break down lactose, the sugar in milk, during infancy and early childhood. Why? Because mother's milk was the only lactase-containing food. So after we were weaned, there was no reason for the body to continue producing lactase. Evolution is nothing if not efficient. So if there's no reason to continue doing something, the body's not going to waste resources and energy doing it. But this all changed with the agricultural revolution and the beginning of domesticating cattle, because then cow's milk all of a sudden became a readily available food source. And this was important because early farmers relied heavily on grains as a staple, and this made them prone to mineral deficiencies, because grains, as we're going to find out later, are not particularly high in nutrients, and they're lacking in several crucial nutrients. Our farming ancestors were shorter than our hunter-gatherer ancestors. They actually shrank, which suggests a deficiency of calcium and vitamin D, which are notoriously absent in grains. And milk, of course, as I'm sure most of you know, is rich in calcium. It contains some vitamin D if it's from pasture-raised cows. It's a complete protein, and it promotes growth. And perhaps most importantly, it provided a source of hydration and sustenance during periods of drought and famine, which became increasingly common during right around the advent of agriculture. We went from being relatively well-nourished in the Paleolithic era to dealing with a lot of food scarcity in the agricultural period. So people with a genetic mutation that would have allowed them to digest milk in adulthood would have been favored by natural selection. And this seems to be exactly what happened. About 8,000 years ago, we know from gene mapping studies, a genetic mutation spontaneously arose in several different parts of the world. This implies that it was just one that enabled us to produce lactase into adulthood, and then it spread rapidly around the world thereafter. But here's the important thing. These changes are relatively simple and crude genetically. They're typically changes in single genes rather than changes that affect the coordinated action of multiple genes, which would be required to fully adapt us to a new food source. And keep in mind that these genetic changes only affect a subset of the population. So yes, it's true that some people have the ability to produce lactase in adulthood, but that's actually only 1/3 of the global population. The remaining 2/3 of people cannot digest lactose into adulthood. And then we have gluten. According to the most recent statistics, 1 in 10 people are gluten intolerant. And this number continually seems to be going up each time it's studied. And I think personally it has something to do with changes in the gut microbiome that are making us even more sensitive to gluten. But that means a substantial portion of people can't tolerate gluten. And what this tells us, or it should tell us, is that yes, it's true we've evolved. Yes, it's true there are some genetic mutations which affect our tolerance of agricultural foods, which is why I think dairy products and legumes might be an acceptable addition to the diet after you've taken those foods out for a period of time and then added them back in. But it's still absolutely true that agricultural foods are far more likely to cause either allergic reaction or an intolerance reaction than paleo foods. It's simple. We've eaten paleo foods for 2 million years, and we've eaten agricultural foods for 10,000 years. Which do you think we're going to be more adapted to? And this is why you don't often hear about blueberry intolerance or broccoli intolerance. And the only intolerance somebody has of broccoli is they don't like eating it, typically. I mean, there is a possibility of being allergic to it, but it's pretty rare. So number 3 is this argument, and this was one of my favorite little gems from the US News and World Report that ranked paleo diet the last diet that you should follow in the world, way below the Slim Fast diet, which is basically a bunch of powdered shakes and bars that are full of sugar, high fructose corn syrup being like the second ingredient in most of them. All right, what genius wrote that article? But one of their criticisms was that there's no evidence behind the paleo diet. And so again, we try to find the grain of truth in all of these critiques. So there is a grain of truth, which is that there isn't as much, there haven't been as many randomized clinical trials on the paleo diet as there have been for the Mediterranean diet, for example, which is a diet that's been very popular for a long time and all the cardiologists got really excited about. However, there are 4 very distinct lines of evidence that even on their own are quite convincing, but when you combine them together, create an extremely compelling evidence-based story for the paleo approach, the paleo template. So number 1 is archaeological studies. So we look at fossil remains and how fossil remains changed from hunter-gatherer period to agricultural period. And one of the biggest changes that we see in fossil remains was that as our ancestors moved from primarily a hunter-gatherer lifestyle to primarily an agricultural lifestyle, they shrank. The average height of men decreased by 6 inches during that transition, and for women it decreased by 5 inches. So that's not an insignificant change. And while within a population, the variance in height from person to person is not necessarily an indicator of health status, I'd like to believe it is, personally, but it's not. But from one population to the next, it is. And it typically is a reflection of the nutritional status of that population, because, of course, we need nutrients like calcium, like vitamin D, for our skeleton to develop properly, plenty of protein to produce enzymes and all the tissues that we need to function well. So the second line of evidence is anthropological. So this is where we study contemporary hunter-gatherer populations, which unfortunately there are few of now that haven't had a lot of contact with the Western world, that have maintained their traditional diet and lifestyle, and we compare their health to the health of people living in industrialized populations. And what those studies almost universally show is that contemporary hunter-gatherers are lean, they're fit, obesity is essentially unheard of, and even being overweight is extremely rare. There's no diabetes, there's no heart disease, there's no autoimmune disease, there's no allergies, there's no asthma. So they're superior in all of those ways, and they also are superior in almost every measure of health and fitness, from insulin sensitivity to body mass index to oxygen consumption, which is one way of measuring physical fitness, to vision, to bone density. So then we have biochemical studies. So these are studies that look at, for example, the nutrient density of foods and also the nutrient completeness of a particular diet. And as we'll see in more detail in the next 2 slides, paleo comes out very well in those biochemical studies. And then finally, we have the much lauded gold standard RCTs, randomized clinical trials. And we do, in fact, have 8 or 9 now RCTs, randomized clinical trials, that have all been extremely encouraging. Some of them have been relatively small studies, so we definitely want to see bigger studies, and we want to see these studies replicated. But some of the results were quite phenomenal. In a couple of the studies, paleo was superior to the Mediterranean diet in terms of weight loss and improvements in metabolic markers. And perhaps more importantly, it was found to be more satiating per calorie than the Mediterranean diet, which means essentially it's easier to stick with, because people who follow paleo feel more satisfied, they're not as hungry, and so they're more able to stick with it over the long term. So critique number 4 is paleo is not nutritionally complete. This is a favorite of mainstream registered dietitians. You often hear this from them. I don't know where they get it, because when you look at this slide, what you find is that a typical paleo diet meets or exceeds, often by many-fold, the RDA for several important nutrients, for all important nutrients except for calcium. So, I mean, just look at vitamin A, 800% of the RDA. Vitamin C, 1,250% of the RDA. Vitamin B6, 515%. B12, 730%. So calcium is 69%, but there are a couple of things to be aware of here. Number one, you can get calcium very easily if you eat bone-in fish. So canned salmon from a place like Vital Choice that still has the bones in it, if you eat that a couple times a week, you're going to be doing very well with calcium. There are also things like bone broth that can be rich in calcium. And of course, if dairy works for you, as I argued before, and you've tried a period of time without it, and you have the ability to digest it into adulthood, you could incorporate some dairy into your diet and easily meet your needs for calcium. So I don't think that's a big shortcoming. And the last thing is that studies suggest that our calcium needs are lower when our magnesium intakes are sufficient, and we get 200% of our requirement for magnesium with paleo. And also probably when our vitamin K2 intakes are sufficient, because vitamin K2 regulates calcium metabolism. So it helps deposit calcium in the bones and the hard tissues where it's needed and keeps it out of the soft tissues where we don't want it. Paleo is extremely nutrient dense, as I mentioned before. sorry, I want to mention this chart here in the data comes from the infamous robwolf.com, so I want to thank him for that. And this is from Matt Lalonde, another incredible researcher in the paleo community. And Matt presented this data originally at the Ancestral Health Symposium a couple of years back, and he did it because there's a big problem with most nutrient density scales. There are a lot of problems, actually, but we don't have time to go into all of them. So the main problem is that most nutrient density scales penalize foods for having high energy density, meaning being high in calories, high saturated fat content, and sodium. So if any food has sodium, saturated fat, or it happens to be high in calories, like fat, for example, or meat that has a substantial amount of fat content, they lowered it on the nutrient density scale, even if it had nothing to do with the actual concentration of nutrients. So Matt wanted to see what a nutrient density scale would look like if you actually just measured nutrients and you didn't penalize foods for containing fat and sodium or being high in calories. And he made some other very important modifications, which you'll just have to trust me about. So as you can see here, the text is small, but organ meats are by far the most nutrient-dense food. So now you all know I'm constantly harping on you to eat liver. It's orders of magnitude higher in nutrient density than even beef down here. Herbs and spices, that's another reason to use these in your cooking, not just for flavor. They actually are extremely nutrient-dense, even in small amounts. Nuts and seeds are next. I put an asterisk there because, as I mentioned before, some foods contain phytic acid, which inhibits mineral absorption, and nuts and seeds are pretty much on the top of the list in terms of phytic acid content. So if you're eating a lot of nuts and seeds, you want to be soaking them beforehand for 12 to 18 hours at least, and then either dehydrating them or roasting them at low temperatures to break down the phytic acid and make the considerable amount of nutrients that they contain more absorbable and bioavailable. Then we have cacao, so chocolate lovers rejoice here. It's one of the most nutrient-dense foods there is. Fish and seafood, beef, lamb, veal, wild game, vegetables, raw, pork, eggs, dairy, poultry, processed meat. Cooked vegetables didn't even make it on this list, but there is an important caveat here, which is that this nutrient density scale is based on only the nutrients that we unequivocally know are beneficial for human health, and that's like all of these vitamins and the typical minerals. It did not include any phytochemicals or antioxidants, which tend to be found in very high concentrations in fruits and vegetables. And I think now, I would argue, and I think Matt would probably agree, that the science behind those is very compelling, and it's very clear that we need a substantial amount of those in our diet to be healthy. So the only caveat I would have with this chart is that if we included those antioxidants and phytochemicals, fruits and vegetables would probably appear higher than they appear now. So the last, it's just sort of, we're still on the critique that paleo's not nutritionally complete. The last aspect of that is that you'll hear some RDs saying, well, you can't do a paleo diet. It doesn't have grains. You know, we need grains to be healthy, don't we? No, we don't, actually. And grains are not the superfoods we've been led to believe they are. They're low on the nutrient density scale. So if you'd have to go, you know, there's vegetables and a whole bunch of other foods before whole grains are about right here. And that's nice, or that's not nice, but the fact is 80% of the grains that we eat in the US are processed and refined. So, and that they're at the very bottom of the scale, right next to sugar and industrial seed oils, which have almost no nutritive value at all. Grains also tend to be missing important nutrients, as I mentioned before. They don't have a broad micronutrient profile. They're lacking in some essential amino acids. They tend to be very low in terms of the bioavailability of those nutrients because they contain phytic acid and other nutrient inhibitors. And there's nothing in grains that we can't get from paleo type of foods in a much more bioavailable way. Does this mean we should absolutely never eat any grains under any circumstances, no matter what? I don't think so, personally. I think that if you eliminate grains from your diet, and then at some point you want to add them back in, and you're willing to go through the preparation steps required to make the nutrients more bioavailable, as groups like the Weston A. Price advocate, soaking, sometimes quite extensively soaking in acid medium like kefir or lemon juice to break down those nutrients, rinsing, and then cooking. If you want to do that and if you don't do that so much that they start to replace more nutrient-dense foods, then I think it's hard to make an argument against that. But most people aren't willing to go to those lengths of preparation, and that's absolutely fine too. We can unequivocally say that grains are not required for human health. Otherwise, we wouldn't be standing here having this conversation, would we? So number 5 is that high protein diet like paleo is dangerous because it wrecks your kidneys and it increases your risk of cancer, right? So we've heard this has come up a lot recently in the media. What's true about it is, if we stretch a little and try to establish that common ground, what's true is that high protein diets can be harmful for people with pre-existing kidney disease, all right? And of course, that doesn't mean that they're harmful for people that are healthy and don't have kidney problems. I mean, by the same logic, iron and iron-rich foods like red meat should be avoided if you have hemochromatosis, which is a disease that causes aggressive iron storage and can kill you if you're not careful. But you don't hear people going around saying everyone shouldn't eat red meat because of the tendency to accumulate iron. And that's the same argument that's being made here. High-protein diets can harm people with kidney problems, therefore nobody should eat a high-protein diet. It's not logical. It doesn't make sense. And I think part of the confusion is that in some studies, it has been observed that with a very high-protein diet, you'll see hyperfiltration. So the kidney is working more actively to do what it does, filter out stuff that is in the blood. And you'll see an increase in the size and function of glomeruli, which are the functional units of the kidney. But so when this was first observed, people thought that this was pathological, but it turns out that these are just adaptive changes. This is essentially like when you work out and your muscles get bigger. This is essentially what's happening with the kidney with a high-protein diet. It's just increasing its capacity to deal with the higher protein diet. There's nothing pathological about it. We also have gold standard randomized clinical trials with very high protein diets in healthy people that show no evidence of harm at all. So what about the idea that diets that are high in animal protein specifically contribute to cancer? Of course, we see this in the China study. Many of you may have seen this recent news headline that high protein diets are as harmful for us as cigarettes. I got about 1 million emails after that one, as you can imagine. And this one is actually a little more complicated. There may be some truth to this, and I don't think we can just dismiss the finding outright. As usual, the devil is in the details, and if there's one person that's really good at exploring the details, it's Denise Minger. So she wrote an article about this that if you really want to geek out and go into a lot of depth, I highly recommend it. I'm just going to summarize some of the main concepts, which I've also talked about on my blog for the last several years. And so the first observation or idea was that if we increase our total protein intake, that increases levels of something called IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which in turn promotes the growth of cancer cells. Okay? That was then later revised to the hypothesis that it's not total protein intakes that matter, but the amount of methionine that we ingest that raises IGF-1 and increases the risk of cancer. Now, methionine is an amino acid that's found primarily in lean proteins, so like lean meats or egg whites or skim dairy, for example. And this is what this study showed. It showed that diets that were high in methionine, which is an amino acid found in lean animal products, can increase the risk of cancer. Okay? So, and the studies were well done. We're not attacking these studies in terms of their methodological errors like we often do. This was a fairly legitimate study and legitimate finding. But the question is, what if there is a way to mitigate or cancel out the potentially harmful effects of high methionine diets without restricting methionine intake? And it turns out that there is. Glycine, which is another amino acid that, unlike methionine, tends to be found in the odd bits of the animal. So the skin, the cartilage, the bone, the tougher, more gelatinous cuts of meat. In bone broth, for example, things like oxtail, shanks, chuck roast, brisket, pig's feet, chicken feet, all of these more gelatinous cuts that we get when we eat from nose to tail are rich in glycine, and glycine balances out the effects of methionine. And in fact, some studies have shown that increasing glycine intake has the same life-extending, health-promoting effects as restricting methionine. And that's not even considering other supportive nutrients that help balance out methionine and complement its roles, like vitamin B6, vitamin B12, folate, vitamin A, and choline. And guess what? All of these nutrients are also found in the odd bits, like the organs and these tougher, more gelatinous cuts of meat. So if you are a paleo purist and you really want to be hardcore paleo, you need to be eating the whole animal. Because I guarantee you, our ancestors didn't kill an animal and say, can you hand me the lean cut? I don't really like fat. Or, they weren't carving up boneless, skinless chicken breast and eating that. In fact, some of the cultures that we studied would throw the lean meat to the dogs. So when they killed an animal, they would eat the organs, the brain, the fatty tissues, and they would just toss the lean meat to the dogs. So this is a reason that we want to eat from nose to tail. It's not just, culinary pleasure is part of it, but it's why I'm always reminding people about the organs and the odd bits, because this can protect us from these potentially adverse effects of high lean protein over time. So I just got the 5-minute warning. I'm going to try to pick this up a little bit. There's only a few more slides left. Number 6 is paleo is dangerous because of saturated fat. I've talked about this a lot. I've written about it a lot, so I'm going to give it the quick summary here. It's true that some people don't thrive on a high-fat diet. I've seen this in my clinical practice. And there are a lot of potential reasons for it. Some genetic mutations which alter fat metabolism, lipid metabolism, things like familial hypercholesterolemia, which can lead to an extreme response to a high-fat diet. Inborn genetic defects in fatty acid metabolism, where people can't shuttle fat into the mitochondria very well. So there's a number of potential reasons. But when you look at the studies, including a very large recent meta-analysis that got a lot of play in the media, you see that there's no strong association between saturated fat intake and heart disease. And in fact, studies show that when you replace saturated fat with carbohydrate, and what are people replacing it with? Processed and refined carbohydrate, you see worse outcomes rather than better. Number 7 is that paleo is dangerous because it doesn't restrict red meat. And this is based on 3 ideas, and I'm going to focus on one of them, which is because we've already touched on the others, and that's that red meat is inflammatory. So this in turn is based on the concept that arachidonic acid, which is a long-chain omega-3, omega-6 fat, which tends to be high in red meat, is inflammatory. So what's true about this is that arachidonic acid is pro-inflammatory. But what's missed in this discussion is it also helps to reduce and resolve inflammation. It's a precursor to compounds called lipoxins, which activate the anti-inflammatory potential of EPA and DHA, which are the long-chain omega-3 fats. So they work synergistically together. And this is probably why we see lower levels of inflammation in epidemiological studies with higher levels of plasma arachidonic acid and EPA and DHA all together. It also explains why the 2 randomized clinical trials that have looked at feeding people up to 1,700 milligrams of arachidonic acid a day, which is between 3.5 and 17 times the average intake in the US, found no increase in circulating inflammatory markers. I think that's it for that one. The second part of this argument, which is red meat causes heart disease, as I'm sure many of you know by now, a lot of the observational studies that showed a correlation between red meat intake and heart disease were confounded by something called the healthy user bias. This is just a fancy way of saying that because red meat has been seen as a villain for so long and unhealthy, people who are eating more red meat in these studies are likely to be engaging in behaviors that actually are unhealthy, like smoking cigarettes or not getting enough physical activity, not eating enough fruits and vegetables. And how do we know that it's not those things that are contributing to the higher rates of heart disease rather than the red meat intake? Well, in an ideal world, we design a study that controls for all those confounding factors. And that's very difficult to do in nutritional research. But some of the bigger, more recent studies that have done that and that have separated out the effects of red meat and processed meat have found that there is no association between fresh red meat consumption and heart disease. So the last argument about red meat is that it causes colorectal cancer. And again, what's true about this is that early epidemiological observational studies suggested that there was a connection. But again, they're all confounded by the healthy user bias. And two very recent, within the last 5 years, reviews, one of them published in the prestigious journal Obesity Reviews, which is one of the highest impact scientific journals, came to this conclusion. The currently available epidemiological evidence is not sufficient to support an independent positive association between red meat consumption and colorectal cancer. And in the text, they say, this is just crazy. There's so many potential confounding factors. All of these studies many of them are poorly designed and don't well control for these confounding factors. So there's really no way that we can say that red meat contributes to colorectal cancer according to the current evidence. So that's my last critique. I'm getting the hook here, so I think we're going to have to open it up to questions, and you can ask me questions about any critiques you have during the Q&A. Thank you.
Please raise your hand.
Thanks.
Please raise your hand and wait for the microphone. Do you have questions? Okay, this is standing room only, and there's no questions for him, really?
I did a great job. I just nailed them. No more critics.
You just nailed that so well that nobody has a question. Hold on. Right back here.
Do you consume any dairy, and if so, what and when? Like how often?
Oh, I love dairy. Yeah, I do. I've done very well on dairy. I've gone long periods. I was a macrobiotic vegan many years ago. I think some of you know this. So I have a soft spot in my heart for the macrobiotic vegans. But it means I went a long time without dairy, and then I reintroduced it. I started with full-fat fermented, 24-hour fermented dairy, like kefir that I made at home, and yogurt that I fermented for 24 hours so that had no lactose at all, or no discernible lactose, and just stuck with that for a while. And then I started with ghee and butter, stuck with those for a while, and then I started introducing some cream. I love cream. I consider coffee to be mostly a cream vehicle. So, my coffee is like that much cream and that much coffee. And I do pretty well with it. So I like it, and I don't see any reason to avoid it from the research that I've seen. But I do think it's important that people go a significant period of time without it before they try that experiment.
Well, I know another reason why I like you so much, Chris. I have coffee with my cream.
Cream vehicle?
Hi. One of the questions I have is, particularly when it comes to organ meats, is the accumulation of environmental toxins. And we see this a lot in deep ocean fish, and it's mercury and all that. But I also wonder in terms of organ meats with beef and other animals.
My understanding is that the toxins primarily accumulate in the fat tissue, and the liver processes toxins, but they tend to accumulate more in the fat tissue. So if we're worried about toxin accumulation, it may be even more important to choose pasture-raised animal products. Of course, that doesn't insulate us from certain environmental toxins that are falling into the grass. But there's no easy way or pat way to answer that question. But at the moment, my sense is that the health benefits of eating organ meats, particularly from pasture-raised animals, outweigh any potential toxicity that we could get from them. Particularly when our detoxification system is working normally. We do have the ability to deal with a certain level of toxins that we're exposed to in the environment, especially for getting the nutrients that we need to deal with them, which happen to be very well represented in liver among some of the other animal foods. But I think you have to wait. Someone up here? Oh, there you are. I'm not in control of it.
So I just wanted to ask, you went through a lot of different things that people commonly will say against paleo. Do you think that, so obviously it's going to take down inflammation and all those sorts of things. Do you think then, on top of that, the change in gut bacteria will compound all those things? So in other words, that the beneficial change in gut bacteria you'd get from something like a paleo diet makes everything else better or more efficient, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. In fact, I think that's probably one of the most important reasons to follow a paleo-type diet with a lot of plant foods. I mentioned before that even though fruits and vegetables weren't well represented on the nutrient density scale because they only looked at a select group of nutrients, that doesn't mean we don't need to be eating them. One of the main reasons we should be eating them is their high phytochemical content, and Dr. Walls has done a lot of great research on that in her book. But also the amount of fermentable fibers they contain. And I think we need to ask, whenever we put something into our mouth, we need to ask, how is this nourishing me? And how is it nourishing my gut ecosystem? And that second question, it's not more important than the first one, but I think it's about of equal importance. I mean, because there's not a day that passes where we don't see another study linking the gut microbiome to some different aspect of health or disease.
Chris, what do you think about the fact that Sweden recently endorsed a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet? And can you imagine that ever happening in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's the U.S. is notorious around the world for being slow to change. In fact, as far as I'm aware, most other industrialized countries now have no dietary restriction on cholesterol because they've reviewed the studies and they found, as anyone would if they reviewed the literature on this topic, that dietary cholesterol has no relationship to blood cholesterol for the vast majority of people. Yet the U.S. still is clinging to these old ideas. And anybody have an idea what that might be about? Cha-ching! Yeah, but I'm definitely a fan of low-carb, high-fat diets in certain circumstances, but I'm also, as many of you know, I've made a point of trying to advocate for paleo as a macronutrient agnostic approach, meaning you can do low-carb, high-fat paleo, you can do moderate-carb, moderate-fat paleo, you can do low-fat, high-carb paleo, and depending on your needs, there's a place for all of those. And but I think certainly dispelling with the fear of the high-fat diet is probably a very positive step.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Oh, hi.
Quick question. What would be your advice when your paleo critics you have at home? They are teenagers, and they won't listen to that advice, any other for that matter.
Those are the toughest critics.
What would be the 2 or 3 things that if you need to live with that, start?
Yeah. We were talking about this a little bit at lunch, actually, and I have to say I'm probably not the best person to ask about this because all my family follows a paleo diet. I have it a little easy in that regard. My daughter was born into it, and that's all she's known. Whereas some other people, I'm sure, in this room could tell you more about their experience transitioning someone to the paleo diet. But just in terms of what I've found to be effective talking to patients and other people in that same way is the more you push, probably the more they're going to push back. And leading by example is typically the most powerful way to encourage change. And just knowing that it's very, very difficult to change somebody when they're not ready to change themselves. And sometimes you can kind of further entrench the polarization by pushing hard. And I know that's really hard when you love somebody and you care about them and you're concerned and you want them to pay as much attention to their health as you're paying to yours. But typically I've found at least that kind of stepping back is often a better approach than getting in their face.
Yeah, Chris, just a question. People that are predisposed to high uric acid levels with regards to meats, of course, and sweetbreads, etc. How do you...
Yeah, well, there is certainly a genetic predisposition oftentimes there. We know of several mutations that can affect that. We definitely want to be investigating liver health and maybe with like a functional medicine specialist, making sure you're getting all of the nutrients that are required for proper liver function. We know of several SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that affect B vitamin absorption status. SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth, can impair B vitamin absorption, which are important for liver function. There are mutations in the methylation pathway that can lead to B6, B12, and folate deficiency, all of which affect liver function. So it starts to get to like another level of exploration, and it's not so easy to talk about here, but if you find a functional medicine specialist who's familiar with those things, they might be able to help.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm a medical practitioner, and I've read a lot of the research on diets such as the Ornish program and Joel Fuhrman, who take more of a vegan or vegetarian approach, and I've seen the results in my own practice, and I've read about it in the research. How do you rectify paleo diet versus those diets when there has been such great success, like with heart disease and diabetes and all sorts of chronic illnesses?
Yeah.
What's the common ground, and what's the part that paleo disagrees with, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is quite easily how we rectify it, because what you have to look at with the Ornish program, it's not ever just the diet. It's always stress management, meditation, increasing physical activity, group therapy and support, which I think is extremely powerful, and there's a lot of research behind that. So you take someone who's doing a standard American diet and totally stressed out, not sleeping, has no social support, and you put them on the Ornish program where all of a sudden they're exercising, have social support, sleeping better, meditating, and going from eating processed and refined food to mostly whole foods, whether regardless of whether it's vegetarian or protein, but animal product based, you're going to see a big improvement in health in that population. I guarantee it. No matter, as long as they're eating whole foods and doing all those other things, they're going to get better. The question is, would they get even better if they were doing those things, eating a nutrient-dense paleo diet? And in my experience working with patients, the answer is yes, because I have many patients who come to me doing one of those types of approaches, and they work well when they're going from the standard American diet to that, but then over time they start to develop nutrient deficiencies, and they're not functioning very well, and we switch them to a similar approach with all those great things, whole food based diet, but add more nutrient dense foods, and they get even better. So I think the similarities are whole foods, and the difference is the nutrient density and anti-inflammatory potential of a paleo diet is higher, in my opinion.
Okay, this is the last question.
Interesting to have my question come after hers, because a lot of the paleo critics in my life are raw vegans, and I used to actually eat that way as well. Yeah. And since I moved on to paleo, unfortunately, I've gotten more consistently bloated, and I have more acne, and so my raw vegan friends are like, come back to the bright side. I'm convinced by the research, and that's why I continue to eat this way, but what would be your response? How can I defend myself in this situation?
Well, I think you should be looking for why you're experiencing these changes. Forget about them for a little bit, and there are a lot of potential causes. One thing is low stomach acid production. If you went a long time without eating meat and then you add animal products back in your diet, sometimes stomach acid production isn't sufficient to process those. The protein putrefies in the stomach. You get bloating, and also, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth would be more likely to happen in that context, and that can cause acne and other skin problems. So I would definitely be looking at the gut and trying to figure out if there's a way that you can improve your digestion and absorption of these foods. I would think about what you're eating more of on the paleo diet, probably certainly meat, but potentially other foods, and what you're eating a lot less of that you were eating before, and see if there's some way that you can maybe join those together a little bit. But it's true, paleo is not magic. It's not a panacea. It doesn't work perfectly for everybody. I wouldn't have a full practice if it did, because I get the people who didn't have the brochure experience. The people who go paleo and they feel absolutely perfect, they're not coming to see me just to say hi and talk to me. I get people like you who switch, and for various reasons, none of which necessarily say anything about paleo approach, they get worse. And I know this is true in the raw vegan community. If someone switches and becomes a raw vegan and starts to have problems, you can bet the raw vegans aren't saying it's because of the diet. They're saying it's because they're not doing it right or well enough or whatever. But it's usually just a question of figuring out how to match your unique needs and circumstances and health status with your diet and your intake of food, and forget about any of the labels. Just focus on what you need to do to feel well within the context of what we know about good nutrition. And, that's the goal. Okay, thank
Chris
you.
Kresser.
Thank you.